Bombings, vandalism, sabotages, physical attacks, martial arts training, military training, and other violent episodes played a role in the British women's suffrage movement. Originally a pacifist movement, the fight for women's suffrage became a national movement with the formation of the National Society for Women's Suffrage, and later, the more influential National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Women's suffrage in the United Kingdom was a movement to give women the right to vote. The British women's suffrage was given the struggle of women not being able to vote and run for office. In the early 1800s, women were second-class citizens. They spent all of their lives being controlled by men, first by their fathers, then by their brothers and male relatives, and lastly by their husbands. Women's purpose in the 1800s was to mainly find a husband, reproduce, and spend the rest of their lives serving and pleasing their significant other. If they chose to remain single, they would be sympathized and ridiculed by their community. Women were not encouraged to obtain a real education or pursue a professional career. And after marriage, women did not have the right to own their own property, keep their own wages, or sign the contract. In addition, all women were denied the right to vote. Women were broken up into three classes: upper working class, underclass, and lower working class. The women in the lower working class maintained a very different lifestyle. Their clothes consisted of dirty torn skirts, blouses, and messy hair. Because of them being underprivileged, they will often rely on relief organizations and prostitution. Majority of the women in the British women's suffrage belonged to the lower working class. Women in this era were treated badly. Their accommodation was poor, their work was uncertain, and they were poorly paid. Some women started working as young as 8 to 12, and unlike the underclass women, they were often sympathized by the higher class crowd because they were not permitted to dress with class. Some of the jobs that were available to them was the domestic service, agricultural laborers, seamstress, washerwomen, and serving the wealthy residents. Women in this category were expected to fulfill their three roles as mother, housekeeper, and worker. Due to these roles, women felt as though they should be able to vote for many reasons, particularly because they had to pay taxes and abide by the law, just as men did. They believed they had an equal right to influence Parliament and the government by voting. Because of this, there was a growing sense of injustice, and from the mid-19th century onwards, groups of women joined together to campaign for the vote. They were known as suffragettes, the word coming from the Daily Mail of 1906. Suffragettes started petitions, sending it to the House of Commons in hopes of being able to vote. Even though one of the petitions had 1,500 signs, they were sadly unsuccessful. Although the British women's suffrage movement had a good reputation to some, the anti-suffragist has its own opinion, classifying suffragists as unladylike and unnatural. The anti-suffragette movement consisted of men and upper working class women. They were, in most cases, well-educated, privileged, earnest, and sincerely believed that the suffragettes were going against God's order and the state of a nation would suffer if women achieved political equality with men. After being denied for so long, Emmeline Pankhurst and others tried a different approach. Emmeline Pankhurst was a well-known suffragette that decided that the suffragettes should try a different strategy. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter, Christabel Pankhurst, founded the Women's Social and Political Union and came up with the motto, "Deeds, not words." Membership of the WSPU was limited to women only. WSPU members were determined to obtain the right to vote for women by any means and campaigned tirelessly and sometimes violently to achieve this aim. They were best known for hunger strikes, force feeding, breaking windows in prominent buildings, setting fires to buildings, tinning themselves to railings, and for nighttime arson of unoccupied houses and churches. The retaliation of violence led to suffragettes being killed and ending up in jail. After being disappointed at the lack of success found by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society's tactics of lobbying and persuading politicians through meetings, they felt that the impact of peaceful protests seemed to have been exhausting and a different, more outspoken and violent approach was needed. The group was now a non-pacifist group and were now labeled as rebels. In 1868, local groups combined to make a series of close-knit groups with the founding of the National Society for Women's Suffrage. This was noted as the first attempt to create a unified front to propose women's suffrage, but had little to no effect due to several splits, once again weakening the campaign. Up until 1897, the campaign stayed at this ineffective level until the First World War hit. During the war, a serious shortage of able-bodied men occurred, and women were required to take on many of the traditional male roles. Women were now in action. Complicated factory jobs were simplified so women could handle them. This led to a new view of what a woman was capable of doing. After the war, millions of women were now meeting the occupational qualifications, which in any case were so old-fashioned that the consensus was to remove them. In early 1916, suffragist organizations privately agreed to downplay their differences and resolved that any legislation increasing the number of votes should also enfranchise women. Finally, in 1918, the Parliament passed an act. This granted the vote to women over the age of 30 who are householders, the wives of householders, occupiers of property with an annual rent of $6.78 in US dollars, and graduate of British universities. About 8.4 million women gained the vote. Women were victorious. In November 1918, the Parliament Qualification of Women Act of 1918 was passed, allowing women to be elected into the House of Commons. By 1928, the consensus was that votes for women had been successful. With the Conservative Party in full control of 1928, it passed the Representation of People Equal Franchise Act that extended the voting franchise to all women over the age of 21, granting women the vote of the same terms as men. The British women's suffrage plays a big role in the United Kingdom today. The legacies of these brave women continue. Stories are passed down, and it is even showed in movies today, including Mary Poppins and the Suffragettes. The British women's suffrage fought injustice and touched the world with their fight for glory, and even inspired other movements, as others pushed for their equal rights as well.
The militant suffragists who formed the Women's Social and Political Union are engaged in the attempt to win the parliamentary vote for the women of this country. Their claim is that those women who pay rates and taxes and fulfill the same qualifications as men voters shall be placed upon the parliamentary register. The reasons why women should have the vote are obvious to every fair-minded person. The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote. Parliament deals with questions of vital interest to women, such as the education, housing, and employment questions, and upon such matters, women wish to express their opinions at the ballot box. The honour and safety of the country are in the hands of Parliament. Therefore, every patriotic and public-spirited woman wishes to take part in controlling the actions of our legislature. For 40 years, this reasonable claim has been laid before Parliament in a quiet and patient manner. Meetings have been held and petitions signed in favour of votes for women.